It's time again for Talking Trade, sponsored by MMAC's World Trade Association and Michael Best Strategies.
Welcome to Talking Trade. I'm Sandi Siegel, president of MEJ.
And I'm Ken Wasilyk, Managing Director of EM Wasilyk and Associates, an international business consulting company. So today it's a great pleasure that we have our guest, Terry Dittrich, an expert in international trade and infrastructure development. We've been met. I met you a long time ago, Terry, when you were the global sales director at Span Creek Global Services in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And then you moved on and started your own business, specializing in assisting clients in various emerging markets and some of the tough ones, Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa. But you've always been focused on the construction and infrastructure projects. So recently, I know you've been concentrating on the rebuilding of a country, Ukraine, and I met you, seen you in work, very skilled negotiator, and you have a master's degree in international economic policy at the American University's School of International Services in Washington. So welcome, Terry, to Talking Trade.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Great. So you've always been active in the construction, the rebuilding, the infrastructure industry, doing various projects around the world outside the United States. And now you're really focusing on the Ukraine. What are some of those initial steps in a very large, immense project like rebuilding a country? And does some of this construction start before the conflict ends, or do we have to wait until there's some ceasing of the military actions?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, if you wait, you'll be too late. That's what the word is when I was in Poland just a couple of weeks ago for the Rebuild Ukraine conference. It was the first of its kind, a big kickoff. And the bottom line is the Europeans, the Asians, and to an extent, some American companies are already in planning, a lot of engineering, planning, design, those types of things for buildings, a lot of formulation of new ministry level initiatives for rebuilding, particularly for things like social housing and hospitals, schools, very immediate need types of projects that are in the process of being both designed and in the initial stages of getting funding.
It's amazing. First of all, thank you, Terry. I'm
Sure.
enamored and really proud of the work you're doing there, and really touches me personally. I'm trying to wrap my head around a major, in construction projects like this, reconstruction, right. And any kind of reconstruction requires a lot of financing, let alone rebuilding an entire nation. So where is the money coming from and the financing, to rebuild Ukraine?
Yeah, so the initial funding obviously has been going towards military, security, and general operations of the country. But obviously they're moving towards the phase of pre-planning, which also includes funding. So far, due to the fact that you've got a major political risk insurance problem where banks essentially are not operating there, and even the multilateral banks and export agencies are really not operating yet. That's the big question mark is there political risk insurance in the offing coming soon that will then start to bolster the idea of putting together major funds, those types of things. Having said that, the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, down in Washington, seems to be taking the lead from the U.S. side, and frankly, even with the European side. EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction Development, World Bank, European Central Bank. There's several multilaterals that are lining up, mainly project specific, and right now I would say focused mainly on basic infrastructure and energy needs. That's a big issue over there. But the bottom line is those multilaterals will be coming in. As you know, the Development Finance Corporation used to be the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which focused on political risk insurance. So what's happening with DFC is they're looking for projects, and to a limited extent, what we've seen in some very select projects is that they're willing to provide a political risk insurance or guarantee for those types of projects. with that said, that's really the formulation. The banks in the country are not operating. The big banks in Europe are starting to kind of put themselves in a position to go in when the conflict starts to dissipate or hopefully ends. But the bottom line is the government doesn't have the money to finance much as far as infrastructure or development. It's just immediate needs for them. Although there's a couple of, I'll say, quasi-private organizations over there, one called Ukraine Invest, which is their investment arm within the country to kind of coordinate with overseas capital coming in. There's also some pretty significant funds from Europe that are starting to set up there. And those funds will be kind of gap financing funds that will also help out the export credit agencies and the multilaterals once they get in. But for now, money is lining up. You can talk to officers in the DFC and Trade Development Agency for feasibility studies, U.S. Commerce, all of them. They're basically starting to focus on putting that in place. But I'd say we're probably 6 to 12 months away from major funding being available. And of course, that's all contingent on things settling down over there. So, but bottom line is pre-planning is going on full speed.
Well, that's great to hear, Terry. And in any type of major rebuilding of a country, there's always the government resources and the government funding and the government backing, but you also need quite a bit of private money and private investment from corporations. And with billions, hundreds of billions of euros and dollars needed for the rebuild, you know, how would a country like Ukraine and its allies attract the private investment? Because we talked about political risk insurance, but you also have the commercial risk as well.
Right. Yeah. And you're seeing, the Swiss banks, the European banks starting to line up for this. So there are avenues for companies, and of course, in their own funding sources back in their native countries, they're starting to line up those types of things. Funds are starting to become more and more available. I'll tell you, the real gateway into Ukraine right now is Poland. So if you go to Warsaw these days, you see capital funds being formed all over. You see investment funds. You see export credits even through Poland for goods and services. So just as a little FYI, if you want to be on the ground in Ukraine today, you actually are best off being in Warsaw, because that's really where people are staging not only the financing, but export capabilities, service capabilities, long-term investments. It's hopping over there, and companies are basically using that as the springboard to go in. Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia to a lower extent, but certainly Poland is the hotspot. So there is a lot of private capital around. There are a lot of investors teaming up with big developers. Ken, you mentioned in the construction field, the Bechtels and the
Right.
KBRs and the Floors, and those guys will be going in as they've done for reconstruction all over the world. It probably takes them a little bit longer. Some of them are connected in the defense community, so they're doing some kinds of work like that are immediate need type of things. But I'd venture to say that those guys will be dragging capital from the US and Canada in there on the private side. But people are really waiting for, obviously this all to end, and then large multilaterals like the World Bank, EBRD, and DFC to go in. They're not going to fund everything in a project. Most of the projects that I've seen, for instance, to give you an example, DFC will fund up to about 60 or 65% of the projects. Then there's equity needed for the final 35 or 40%. In some cases, that's local investors or local construction groups in my sector. In other cases, it's investment funds that are looking to go in. So it's going to be a combination. Nobody's going to go in and finance everything. They talk about a Marshall Plan that may be in the offing, but there's certainly going to be a need for private capital to be able to provide that gap financing.
It's interesting that you mentioned Poland being the center of this. Historically, Ukraine and Poles have been united as a country, and as well as under the Austrians and the Russians as well. And I have a personal interest because actually my name is actually a Ukraine root, and all that places of Shemel and Rzeszów and all that, that's where my roots are.
Great. Well, It's amazing what's going on in Poland. I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to be a huge recipient of funds going in there, and I think they have a very bright future. And Lviv, the biggest
Yes.
city that is really the hub in Ukraine now, is just a few hours away. Granted, right now it's tough to take the train in there and cross the border and those types of things, but it will be almost like a Milwaukee to Chicago type of circumstance,
Right.
frankly speaking, once you get the border. And a lot of companies are starting to set up operations, whether it's service or manufacturing, right along the inside, of course, the Polish border, so that the risk factor is much lower. But they're really setting up to springboard into Lviv and then the rest of Western Ukraine. Like the biggest challenge that we're hearing on the ground over there is who's going to go to Kharkiv and the Far East cities that have been completely decimated. Who's going to actually go in there? And that's going to take very direct, major funding. It's going to be a real challenge. Western Ukraine has been, frankly speaking, pretty much untouched as far as infrastructure and those types of things. So that's the easy springboard to step in.
Well, it's encouraging to hear some of the investment, the private investment that you speak of, and and the energy and around that. As we wrap it up today, Terry, what can you recommend? What are your thoughts on best opportunities for small or medium-sized companies that want to participate and get involved in helping the rebuilding?
Yeah, I just spoke on this at the META meeting
Right.
recently, and the bottom line is for the small to mid-sized companies, they've got the opportunity to go in as subcontractors or equipment suppliers and whatnot. I think the way to connect to them, I'm involved with the Rebuild Ukraine Agency, which is a new quasi-private public partnership in DC. If anybody would want to contact me, I'm the chairman of the construction committee, although there's several other sectors represented. Be happy to put them in contact with there. And then obviously DFC, Trade Development Agency, and U.S. Department of Commerce. Commerce is not full speed on the ground in Kiev at this point. They're still really operating out of DC, but certainly worth connecting with them and kind of following the same path, and then trying to connect to some of those bigger guys that are going in.
Terrific. Well, again, amazing work you're doing. Thank you for all that you're doing and all the information you shared today. And thank you for joining us on Talking Trade.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to get Wisconsin companies into Poland and then springboard into Ukraine. This is going to be the biggest construction site in the world sometime in the next year or so. So thanks for having me.
Thanks,
Terry.
You've been listening to Talking Trade, sponsored by MMAC's World Trade Association and Michael Best Strategies.